television in America isn't as mature as it is in England.
No, it's
you can't
very
say
good in
certain
England,
things.
yeah. I can't
but
watch TV in America, to tell you the truth. It's such a load of rubbish.
They called him the Quiet Beatle. Calm, gentle, romantic. But behind George Harrison's soft smile was a fire, a list of grudges, a secret hate list of music legends who rubbed him the wrong way. Some mocked him, some ignored him, some betrayed his trust. And one name, tied to Hollywood's favorite white powder, shocked even his friends. So, who exactly made George Harrison's blacklist? Let's pull back the curtain. The rise of the Quiet One. George Harrison wasn't born into fame. He was born into noise. February 25th, 1943, Liverpool. World War II, sirens in the sky. A working-class family doing whatever it took to get by. George's father drove a bus. His mother sang around the house. Music was his escape. A way out of the gray streets of post-war Britain. By age 12, George wasn't just listening to music. He was consumed by it. He carried a battered guitar everywhere. Neighbors remember him playing until his fingers bled. He wasn't the loudest kid in the room, but he was the most determined. At 14, something happened that changed everything. George met a kid named Paul McCartney on the school bus. Paul introduced him to another boy, John Lennon. Together, they played in a scrappy little band called the Quarrymen. No one thought much of it, just teenagers making noise. But in George's hands, the guitar wasn't noise. It was power. He studied every chord, every solo, every riff he could copy from American records. While John and Paul fought for attention, George stayed in the background, quietly sharpening his craft. By 16, he dropped out of school to apprentice as an electrician. It was practical, it paid a little, but George's heart was never in wires and circuits. His heart was in music. And then, in 1960, everything shifted. The Quarrymen landed a tour in Hamburg, Germany. Seedy clubs, long nights, endless sets. That's where George hardened into a real musician. Not the kid with a guitar anymore, but a professional. And when the Beatles finally exploded worldwide, George stood apart. Not the joker like Ringo, not the witty frontman like John, not the perfectionist like Paul. Instead, George became the Quiet Beatle. The press loved the label, he didn't. Why? Because it wasn't true. George wasn't shy, he wasn't timid. He was observant, calculated, watching. The quiet image stuck after one infamous moment. Just days before the Beatles' debut on The Ed Sullivan Show, George caught a brutal throat infection. Doctors ordered total silence. No talking, no singing, not a word. So when the Beatles made history on that stage, George barely spoke. Cameras caught his stillness. And from that night on, the nickname The Quiet One haunted him for life. But quiet didn't mean weak. Behind that calm stare was a man who hated being underestimated, a man who wanted his songs heard. And every time one was cut from an album, the resentment grew. The stage was set. The smile on George Harrison's face would charm the world. But inside, the grudges were already taking root. Elvis Presley, idol shattered, before George Harrison became a Beatle. He was just a skinny kid pedaling his bike through Liverpool. One day, passing a house, he heard it. A sound that froze him in place, a voice dripping with danger, rebellion, and raw power. It was Elvis Presley, Heartbreak Hotel. That single song didn't just entertain George, it rewired him. He later admitted, "When I first heard Elvis, I knew I was never going to be the same again." To young George, Elvis wasn't a singer. He was a revelation, a poor boy with a guitar who shook the entire world, proof that music could break chains and rewrite destiny. Throughout the early Beatles years, Elvis was untouchable. The hair, the swagger, the voice that made teenage girls scream. The Beatles modeled their style, their ambition, even their attitude on Elvis. But then came the moment of truth. The 1970s. George finally met his childhood hero, and what he saw broke his heart. The rebel in leather? Gone. The raw rock and roll outlaw? Vanished. In his place stood a man drowning in sequins, a bloated Vegas act surrounded by trumpets, backup singers, and glittering jumpsuits. George sighed to friends afterward. I just wanted to tell him. Put on some jeans, a black shirt, drop the backup singers and the trumpets, and go play That's All Right Mama like you used to. It wasn't just disappointment. It was betrayal. For George, Elvis had traded authenticity for spectacle. The king had abandoned his throne. Word of George's remarks made its way back to Presley, and Elvis wasn't amused. He gave a cold smile and muttered, "If he thinks I'm going back to playing in little bars just to please somebody, then he doesn't know a thing about Elvis Presley." That was it. Two worlds divided. For George, Elvis became a fallen idol, proof that even gods of music could lose their way. For Elvis, George was just another critic who didn't understand the price of survival. What began as worship ended in regret. A childhood dream shattered under the neon lights of Las Vegas. Paul McCartney, brother turned rival, before the stadiums, before the screaming fans, before the world even knew the word Beatlemania. There were just two boys on a bus, Paul McCartney and George Harrison, teenagers with cheap guitars and endless curiosity. They'd sit side by side, trading chords, teaching each other licks, obsessed with rock and roll pouring out of American radio. Paul later said George was like his kid brother, the quiet shadow who followed him everywhere, a bond built on music, late-night practice sessions, and shared dreams of escaping Liverpool. But what started as brotherhood twisted into rivalry. By 1967, the Beatles weren't a scrappy club band anymore. They were gods, and Paul McCartney was seizing control. His fingerprints were all over Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. A masterpiece, yes, but also a signal that Paul was becoming the de facto leader. George felt it immediately. Every time he brought in a song, Paul had notes, changes, suggestions. Songs were pushed aside, cut, or ignored entirely. 2 or 3 tracks per album, if he was lucky. To George, it wasn't guidance, it was suffocation. The tension boiled over during the Abbey Road sessions in 1969. George was finally writing songs that could stand toe-to-toe with Lennon and McCartney's, but Paul couldn't resist tweaking them, polishing them, taking control, and George snapped. His frustration spilled out in one of his bluntest lines ever. "I'd rather have Willie Weeks play bass than Paul McCartney. That's the truth. I respect Paul, but he's too overpowering." That wasn't just about bass lines, it was about control. It was George saying, "I am not your kid brother anymore." The wounds ran deeper than music. Years later, George admitted, "Paul has ruined me as a guitar player." Coming from Harisson, a man who idolized guitar, that wasn't just criticism. That was heartbreak. And yet, here's the twist. Even in the middle of resentment, there was still affection. George once said, "No matter what we've been through, there's always something that ties us together." Their bond was fractured, but never fully broken. That's the tragedy of George and Paul. A brotherhood poisoned by rivalry, but kept alive by a thread of love neither could cut. John Lennon, admiration to bitterness. Before the world knew them as legends, George Harrison looked at John Lennon with awe. John wasn't just another boy with a guitar, he was sharp, funny, magnetic. The kind of leader who could walk into a room and make everyone orbit around him. To young George, John was the big brother he wished he had. The rebel, the wit, the spark. And for a while, that admiration fueled him. He studied John's humor. He soaked up his charisma. He learned how to hold his own standing next to Lennon's fire. But as the Beatles rose, the admiration began to sour. John was a giant. George was still the quiet one. Every time George brought in a new song, Lennon barely hid his indifference. One time, George played a demo he was proud of. John shrugged and said flatly, "It's fine, but it's not something I'd listen to." That cut deep. And then came spirituality. George's devotion to Indian music and meditation wasn't a phase. It was his lifeline. But, to Lennon, it was just another target. "Don't start telling me about those Indian saints again," John snapped in one recording session, slicing through George's sincerity like it was a joke. The cracks widened. What had been brotherly respect turned into cold distance. Conversations dried up. Warmth evaporated. By the time the Beatles collapsed, their connection was little more than a formality. George would later admit Lennon could be selfish, difficult, cruel. And when he published his memoir, I, Me, Mine, in 1980, one name was almost completely missing: John Lennon. Not by accident, by design. The silence spoke louder than any insult. When asked why, George smiled and said, "Some things don't need to be mentioned." Even after Lennon's tragic death, George refused to rewrite history. He mourned John, yes, but he never sugarcoated the past. The pain, the dismissals, the lack of respect, those wounds had never healed. For George, Lennon wasn't just a bandmate. He was a fallen hero, the man he once admired most, who ended up cutting him the deepest. Neil Young, the voice. He hated. George Harrison almost never trashed fellow musicians in public. He was polite, careful. Even when he didn't like someone, he kept it to himself. Almost. Because in 1992, George broke character. During a recording session, when Neil Young's name came up, Harrison didn't hesitate. He fired a shot that stunned everyone in the room. "I'm not a Neil Young fan. I hate it. Yeah, I can't stand it." And then he twisted the knife. "The main thing is his voice. I like a couple of his songs. But that voice? Worse than mine." For someone as reserved as George, that wasn't just criticism. That was war. He didn't stop there. George mimicked Neil's famous ragged guitar solos right in the studio. Then he sneered, "It's laughable. He does a solo in the middle of a song, and I look at Eric Clapton and say, 'What's that about?'" The room went quiet. It was rare to hear Harrison that blunt. This wasn't the calm, mystical Beatle. This was the brutally honest George, spitting out what most musicians only whispered. And fate wasn't done stirring the pot. That same year, George and Neil ended up sharing a stage at Bob Dylan's 30th anniversary concert, Bobfest. Dozens of rock legends lined up to honor Dylan. But backstage, everyone noticed the chill. George kept his distance, barely looked Neil in the eye. Reporters at the time said Neil had already heard about George's scathing remarks. But instead of firing back, Young shrugged it off. "Everyone's entitled to an opinion," he told journalists. "I didn't like certain artists when I first heard them either. Time changes how you see things." On stage, Neil smiled, sang, and stood shoulder to shoulder with George as if nothing had happened. George? He wasn't hostile, but he wasn't warm either. Professional, polite, cold. For fans, it was surreal. Two giants of rock, together under the spotlight, but separated by a wall of disdain. For George, Neil Young wasn't just a musician he didn't vibe with. He was proof that even in a world built on rebellion, not every voice deserved a standing ovation. Pete Townshend, the false prophet. For George Harrison, music and spirituality weren't hobbies. They were lifelines. When he discovered Indian music and meditation, it wasn't a phase. It was salvation, a sacred path he believed should never be cheapened. So when he saw someone faking it, it lit a fire in him. Enter Pete Townshend, the Who's wild guitarist, the man famous for smashing guitars, swinging his arm like a windmill, and blasting arenas with thunder. But Pete wasn't just about volume. He sprinkled his music with spiritual themes too, especially in Tommy, a rock opera steeped in references to his guru, Meher Baba. To the public, it looked deep. It looked enlightened. But to George Harrison, it looked like a costume. In a 1966 interview, George cut straight through the facade. Townshend? Yeah. Every time I've met him, he's been stoned, talking rubbish. I don't think he's serious about all that religion stuff. No hesitation, no politeness. George was calling him out as a fraud, a man using spirituality as stage decor, while George saw it as truth. But the rift didn't stop at philosophy. There was a darker, more personal shadow. Because Pete Townshend wasn't just dabbling in fake enlightenment. He was also tangled up in George's private heartbreak. Eric Clapton, George's best friend, had fallen in love with Harrison's wife, Pattie Boyd. Townshend knew. And instead of keeping distance, he allegedly helped Clapton in his pursuit. That betrayal cut deeper than any guitar rivalry. So now George looked at Townshend not just as a false prophet, but as a friend who had, even indirectly, helped dismantle his marriage. In the grand clash of 60s rock titans, this feud wasn't about who played faster solos or sold more records. It was about something rawer: truth versus pretense, faith versus fakery, sacred love versus selfish desire. George Harrison demanded purity. Pete Townshend, in his eyes, represented everything that polluted it. Liam Gallagher, excess baggage. By the mid-1990s, Oasis weren't just a band. They were a movement. Britpop's loudest, cockiest frontmen, the Gallagher brothers, were hailed as the new torchbearers of British rock. The press couldn't resist. Oasis are the new Beatles. It was the kind of headline guaranteed to make Beatles fans dream. A symbolic passing of the crown. One generation of Liverpool legends handing the torch to Manchester's bad boys. But George Harrison wasn't buying it. Not for a second. In a 1996 radio interview, Harrison dropped a grenade. Liam Gallagher? He seems a bit out of date. And rather silly. And then came the real knockout punch. I think it's been proven. When you see the band without him holding a microphone, he's just excess baggage. That line didn't just bruise Liam's ego. It humiliated him. George Harrison, one of the original Beatles, had essentially said, "You're not John Lennon's heir. You're not even necessary." For Liam Gallagher, that was war. He fired back in true Gallagher style on MTV News. "I still love the Beatles, but personally, I think he's a fucking clown. If I saw him, I'd tell him straight. A proper clown." He wasn't done. He just reads the papers. He's the one who's really out of touch. The feud splashed across tabloids, feeding the fire of the Beatles' first Britpop narrative. Fans dreamed of a historic handshake between the icons. Instead, they got a public mud fight. For George, Oasis weren't heirs. They were hype. Cheap echoes of a revolution the Beatles had already perfected decades earlier. For Liam, George was the grumpy old guard, a dinosaur who couldn't recognize the new kings of rock. And just like that, the bridge between two generations collapsed. Instead of unity, it became rivalry. The Beatles' quiet one versus Britpop's loudest mouth. And in the end, neither man backed down. Harrison dismissed, Gallagher exploded, and British rock history got one of its juiciest cross-generational feuds. Elton John, cookie cutter, and cocaine. On the surface, George Harrison and Elton John looked like friends. They jammed together. They hit the same parties. The press called them close, but the reality, not so warm. In 1976, George dropped a bomb in an interview. He said Elton's music sounded all the same. "One good song years ago," George shrugged. "The rest? Just formula. 4 chords, some lyrics, shake it up." Boom, another Elton John hit. That wasn't just casual criticism. It was a dagger aimed right at Elton's identity during the peak of his career. Remember? This was the mid-70s. Elton was selling out stadiums, topping charts, dominating pop culture. And here comes George, calling his art factory made. But Elton didn't fight back. He never went public with insults. Instead, he took the high road. Years later, he even called George the wise man of the Beatles, saying Harrison had found something more valuable than fame. And yet, behind the scenes, there was another layer. At a glamorous Hollywood party, full of stars and full of cocaine, George cut through the noise. He looked Elton dead in the eye and said, "For God's sake, cut down on that marching powder." No sugarcoating, no polite hints, just brutal honesty. In a room where everyone else laughed, partied, and pretended, George spoke the one truth nobody else dared to say. It stung Elton, but it also stayed with him. Their relationship was complicated, cold, even bitter at times, yet also strangely protective. George didn't like Elton's music, but he cared enough about the man to warn him about the drugs that were quietly destroying him, and Elton never forgot it. Years later, he admitted that Harrison's words were the only real wake-up call he'd gotten during those dark years. It's a perfect picture of George Harrison, critical, sharp, unforgiving about the art. But when it came to life, deep down, he still cared. The legacy of George's grudges. George Harrison's life was filled with contradictions. To the world, he was the quiet Beatle, gentle, spiritual, the calm presence standing next to John and Paul's chaos. But behind the stillness was fire. George was observant, but he was also sharp. And when something offended his sense of truth, he never forgot it. Elvis, Paul, John, Neil Young, Pete Townshend, Liam Gallagher, Elton John. Each name told a story of disappointment, rivalry, or outright disdain. But here's the twist. George's grudges weren't just about ego, they were about authenticity. He wanted music to be real. He wanted spirituality to be sacred. He wanted honesty even when it hurt. When he thought Elvis sold out, he grieved for the death of authenticity. When Paul and John dismissed his songs, he felt betrayed by the very brothers he'd built history with. When Pete Townshend paraded spirituality on stage, George saw it as a stain on something holy. When Liam Gallagher strutted around as the new Lennon, George saw noise without depth. And when Elton John spiraled into the excess of fame, George was the one person blunt enough to warn him. His grudges were harsh, sometimes unfair, but they came from a place of principle. And maybe that's why people loved him, because in a world of glitter, egos, and yes men, George Harrison stood apart. He wasn't afraid to call out the false prophets, the sellouts, or even his own bandmates. He was quiet, but he wasn't submissive. He was spiritual, but never naive. He was harsh, but in his own way, deeply honest. And that's the paradox of George Harrison, the man remembered for his peace and gentleness, who carried grudges sharper than a knife. Because sometimes being the quiet one doesn't mean holding your tongue. It means waiting, watching, and striking only when it matters most. So, what do you think of George Harrison's secret hate list? Did he have a point? Or was he just too harsh? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. And if you enjoyed this dive into the hidden side of music legends, make sure you hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next untold celebrity story. Because here, we don't just talk about fame. We reveal what's really behind the spotlight.